Good afternoon, or maybe I should also add good morning and good evening to all participants gathered here on site, and everybody who are listening and watching us now online. I welcome you all to the international session of the conference Interpretation for Heritage Protection, Values, with this idiom values. My name is Piotr Zmyślony, and it's a great pleasure to be your host this afternoon and evening. Today, in this panel, we have 5 presentations, and we can say that it is a really, truly international panel because we will be able to hear some viewpoints from North America, South Africa, Central Europe, and Western Europe also. So I would like to welcome all presenters and all participants. Ladies and gentlemen, and of course we have the special guest today. We called his presentation even the Grand Lecture. We are proud to welcome our first presenter, Professor Neil Silbermann. Professor will be talking about interpretation as shared heritage, new direction in a time of change. Professor, the microphone and the screen is yours. Welcome to our conference.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to join you this afternoon. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person next time. And I certainly want to thank the Poznan Heritage Center and all the other sponsors of this conference for inviting me. And really what I want to speak about for the next few minutes is as much about change as about interpretation. The title, as we've just heard, of this session is Interpretation for Heritage Protection, focusing on values. And what I want to speak about is perhaps different kinds of values, different kinds of strategies that have arisen because of the enormous changes that have happened in cultural heritage, not only in the last 2 years of the pandemic, but even before that. Well, I want to begin by saying that there's nothing so susceptible to change as heritage. We tend to think of it as solid and unchanging and really the bedrock of modern society. But our tastes in heritage and the official ideas of what heritage is have certainly changed over, let's say, the last 25 or 30 years. Traditionally, that is before that time, heritage really focused on architectural monuments. In a few cases, archaeological monuments too, but they were significant assets seen as let's say, the backbone of a country's history. And I mention country because when we're dealing with international initiatives like the UNESCO World Heritage List, it is really national governments that have tended to identify what is heritage and protect it themselves for the general population. But in the last 30 years or so, a lot of different kinds of heritage have become accepted. not only vernacular heritage, that is to say, the common buildings of certain periods and so forth, but things like railroad trains and other vehicles, modern architecture. In essence, anything that has significance for the population. And we'll talk about who that population is. But beyond the expansion of the various types of tangible heritage, a major change since certainly since the 2003 UNESCO Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage has added a huge different field of folklore, performance, music, cuisine, and all those intangible elements that aren't monuments but are still very much part of what a culture prizes and wants to carry on. Now, with the huge expansion of heritage types, both tangible and intangible, we've also faced a dramatic cut in government funding for the protection and safeguarding of these various kinds of heritage, which makes it much more difficult for anyone tackling the problem of how do we protect what has been handed down and pass it on to future generations. And I want to begin by saying that when the 𝐡𝐞𝐫𝐢𝐨𝐧 2008 Charter for the Presentation and Interpretation of Cultural Heritage Sites was formulated and ratified by 𝐡𝐞𝐫𝐢𝐴Z, some things became very evident about the nature of interpretation. Basically, that it is an emotional relationship, not just the description of facts about things. We made a definite distinction in the charter between heritage presentation, which is usually designed and implemented by either national antiquities services or museum designers, and it is meant to be a kind of one-way means of communication, that an expert or a scholar tries to convey to audiences what the facts about the heritage are. And of course, facts are certainly important, but we recognized that interpretation as an alternative is an activity that everyone at a cultural heritage site does, whether it is a child trying to figure out or being amused by a historical reenactor, or other people trying to understand what the interpretation means to them. And so we have moved from a period where interpretation, or in this case presentation, was really a didactic exercise in having an expert teach the public about what they should know about heritage, to a much more subtle relationship between the site and people. And we'll go into this in much more detail. Now, one can't leave it at that it's a relationship. That's too vague. There are many different kinds of relationship. And rather than deal with the techniques of a special kind of interpretation, I wanted to just bring to your attention some different kinds of relationships between visitors and local residents and a heritage site. It can be relic worship. It can be the kind of veneration of local communities of something that has amazingly survived. It can be part of a family or ethnic tradition that people visit, so that younger generations can inherit that tradition. It can, of course, be patriotism. That is the traditional way that cultural heritage has been used by national governments to encourage a sort of cohesion and the idea of a single essence of the country. In more recent times, people have gone to heritage sites for personal identity. That is, subjects that they're particularly personally interested in, whether that is aviation or medieval warfare or a million other things that people are interested in. And finally, and this is an important one, it can be used as an economic resource, which has become, at least before the recent decline in world tourism due to the pandemic, certainly a primary reason for publicizing and interpreting cultural heritage sites. Now, none of these is exclusive. They're all sort of mixed together in the audience that a cultural heritage site hosts. But it's important for interpreters to just think to themselves, who am I speaking to? Who is the partner in this relationship, and what do they want? And beyond even identifying the relationship, there are different strategies for the interpretation. Are we talking about something that is valuable just as a relic? Is it intrinsic, or is it instrumental for economic development, for social cohesion, for some other purpose? And that is the question of, is it a relic or a resource? And as I mentioned before, is it tangible or intangible? Are the values that people come to see in the stones and bricks of the site, or are they something intangible, something cultural that the heritage site embodies? Is success of the interpretation measurable or transcendent? And let me explain what I mean by that. Is it measurable in terms of revenue that the site generates, the number of visitors that it attracts, or is it just a transcendent idea that people should know about this place? And in terms of the strategy, the difference there is really tremendous. And is the point also along this idea of intrinsic and instrumental? Is it being conserved just so that it can remain for future generations? Or is it being commodified in some way, as I said, for local economic development, real estate development, and so forth? And finally, the question that faces all interpreters is the message going to be specific to the place and to the historical context, or is it a wider universal message in which the site represents, symbolizes these larger ideas and philosophies, ideologies, and so forth? And finally, what are the tools for interpretation? We often think that interpretation is either spoken or written on text panels or programmed into interactives. But there are other ways that are really more basic, and they are physical conservation, which we all know is the basis of heritage, cultural heritage programs everywhere. Is it education? Is it national recognition? That is, recognizing the spirit of the nation, or having the nation recognize this place as an especially important chapter in its history. And as I mentioned, real estate development and then tourism. Now, I want to go through all of these and sort of talk about how they have changed and what problems we face in using these tools as interpretive instruments, as the way to deal with interpretation. Now, the first one is physical conservation. And as I said, this is, of course, perhaps the oldest method of interpretation, of taking a building or a ruin, an archaeological site, or even a ruined building, and using engineering and scientific techniques to restore it. It's also the most expensive, and that's why choices have to be made in what is physically reconstructed, physically conserved, not necessarily reconstructed, because all over the world, we see around us buildings, structures, monuments that are really deteriorating everywhere. And that is not even to mention the tremendous damage that is being done through climate change, urban pollution, and really stunning, unexpected natural catastrophes like earthquakes and tsunamis and so forth. The scale of the destruction and the deterioration is absolutely unprecedented, not only due to these natural causes, but to the growth of cities and the modern methods of construction in industrializing regions all over the world, where it may seem to be cheaper to the decision makers to destroy ancient buildings, not rehabilitate them, but build modern structures. So less and less of the whole scope of interpretation is actually dealing with physical restoration, which is being replaced by all kinds, as we know, as I'm speaking here, by online visits, virtual visits, and so forth. Now, I want to move on to education, because education really also, next to the excavation of ancient sites and the conservation of ancient sites, was really where it all began, particularly in Central Europe in the 19th century, although obviously France and the United Kingdom were very much involved in this. And the whole idea was to teach children, to teach the general public to be good citizens. And for each country, there was this idea of a single national spirit that was evoked through national symbols, that was until recently unquestioned. But in our recent past, let's say this 30 years of change I'm referring to, there have been a lot of oppositional interpretations due to the growth of identity politics. Whether this is indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, certain neighborhoods within a city, and so forth, the idea of heritage is a kind of legitimation. When people's heritage, even smaller group, sub-national groups' heritage, is threatened or commemorated, it is a political act. And that political act can even get into political debates of the present. And here we see a picture of basically the Greek Communist Party having a demonstration on the Acropolis in Athens, utilizing the symbol of the Parthenon as a political slogan. And it can get even more violent than just political, as we see here in the Hindu demonstrations at the Babri Mosque, at the former site of the Babri Mosque in Ayodhya in India, where Hindus claimed that this was the site of an earlier Hindu temple. And this became a huge, violent national incident, and there are many of this kind all over the world. The point that I'm getting to is that we often think that the preservation and commemoration of heritage is an unmitigated good. The more heritage, the better. But what I'm trying to point out here is that, in fact, sometimes heritage, especially now, can have a darker side and can be the cause of not social cohesion, but social rupture. And this is something that interpreters need to deal with. Now, just moving on in this brief presentation, I want to talk about another issue, and that is the whole idea of heritage as the basis of economic development. Whether it is the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or the European Commission, or as seen here, UNESCO, the idea that the restoration of historic districts can provide economic benefit for cities all over the world. Unfortunately, it's not an unmixed blessing. Although historic districts can become very fashionable areas and attract a whole new population and raise the real estate values in these historic districts very much, there is the downside that, in fact, it often displaces those that have lived in the older areas. So here, too, when we think about economic development and use interpretation to push for it, we also have to be aware of the difficulty that it can sometimes cause for the most vulnerable people in society. One quick other issue, and this is a picture from Angkor Wat in Cambodia. Sometimes the real planning of popular tourist attractions can transform heritage into something of a local industry rather than a heritage site. And although it brings in revenue, it changes the nature of the site, particularly for the local population, into another place of work where they go in the morning to do all the jobs that a site requires, but go home at 5 o'clock and tend to think of this as a local industry. Now I want to briefly get to my suggestion. We must, in this age of identity politics, local pride, communities, belonging, to focus on the people that are directly affected, that live around or are connected to cultural heritage sites. And I suggest that we've got to look at the idea of interpretation as participatory action research. That is, that visitors are not merely lectured to about the site, but they actively participate in the research and additional meanings that are given to cultural heritage sites. I've certainly noticed in my career a division between the generations, particularly with high tech, with digital communications of various kinds. And one of the ways of bridging this gap is to really start interpretive programs that involve younger people with collecting all kinds of data. Here we see the generations engaged in oral histories about sites and memories and so forth. And this is a really important way to bring the generations together and yet have them take an active part. One of my favorite other, and there are many methods of participatory action research, is something called Photovoice. And I personally have used this in a program that I did with my colleagues in the Caribbean, 14 Caribbean nations. And that is basically giving school groups, individuals, clubs of various kinds, cameras, and having them go out and document what really is important to them about a city, a site, and so forth. And the result is a broadening of the interpretation to cover those who are personally connected to the site. And an additional advantage of Photovoice is the fact that families can be brought into it in special exhibitions at the cultural heritage sites to see what their relatives or children have expressed about the site and its significance. Another important tool that we used for interpretation was cultural mapping. And here's a scene from the abandoned train station in Kingston, Jamaica, where groups went out and spoke to people and mapped on a map the different locations that were significant to people. This, of course, helps very much in planning matters, so that instead of just having the officially recognized sites, there's almost a memory map that planners can use about which are particularly sensitive areas of the city. And online, it can become a different kind of social media beyond the Facebook and so forth. I'm showing here a picture of the Arches program that was developed by the Getty Conservation Institute and the World Monuments Fund, which is an open source portal for people to basically put on a map and have it put online the places that they find particularly significant. And one of the great advantages of online applications like this is that people can upload digital copies of pictures that are particularly interesting, show how places have changed, how families have been related, as well as all those intangibles of oral histories and recipes and so forth. Basically, what I'm saying is that we have spoken in interpretation as either top-down or bottom-up, but they're really not the same thing in changed directions. Top-down, as we see on the left, comes from a source, and it is basically information that is distributed to the greatest amount of people. Bottom up, however, is creating a network. As a famous recent book has said, the point of cultural programs of all kinds is to create a community, not an audience. And this is a great slogan for cultural heritage presentation as well, because what heritage can do to add to this idea of being shared is to encourage people, whether they are visitors from outside or people that live in the immediate vicinity, to recognize, for whatever reason they see, that this place matters. And that is the key to sustainability in our period of enormous cultural, economic, and social change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this insightful speech. I was happy to hear you talking about some tools of interpretation, because in Poznań, here in Poznań Heritage Center, we used these methods and many of these tools and methods you spoke about. So it was a pleasure to listen to you. Just some organizational issues. If you have the question, because now we are opening for some Q&A session after the speech. If you have the question, please write it in the chat box, and then I will read it to Professor. So there is a question, Professor. So I am reading it right now from Professor Michał Pawleta, who asked, how, in your opinion, can we employ heritage interpretation methods in a successful and efficient implementation of human rights politics?
Well, again, I think that it is important not to make grand. Let me phrase this as carefully as I can. In many countries, the idea of human rights is seen as an attack on the government and the heritage ministry or whatever. I think that the best way to start with a human rights oriented interpretation is really getting small groups in small areas, like I showed pictures of, and really having people transform cultural heritage interpretation into just discussion about the things that people are most concerned about. Obviously, to go against government projects is going to basically create all kinds of problems, particularly in something like the World Heritage List. Now, here's another issue that has to be considered in terms of human rights. Are we to judge every period in history by what is acknowledged as human rights today? Are the remains of, let's say, the Roman Empire, gladiators, or slavery in the Roman Empire to be explicitly interpreted as wrong and violating human rights? These are questions that have to be hammered out in conversation with local groups. I think that this is a very important issue, because governments often use cultural heritage to be a sort of shield against accusations of human rights by saying that this land belonged to X group and not another group. And as I showed from the example in India and the Middle East and Asia, we can find many examples of this. So I would answer briefly by saying that the solution is really trying to organize local groups and empowering them to speak about what is most significant to them.
Thank you very much. There is another question from Professor Michał Pawleta. Can heritagization that is driven in a large part by market forces and has often nothing to do with protection or interpretation of heritage be seen as a vital element of identity politics? Another very important question.
I think it's not so much an issue of identity politics as it is an issue of commerce, of business, of what makes the most money. Often I am confronted with people saying that a particular interpretive plan is like Disneyland. If only those that invested could be as sophisticated as the Disney Corporation in understanding what people want to see, then it might be legitimate. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's an entirely different business. That is to say, it is more the entertainment industry than it is anything connected with the deeper significance of the past. It is really cultural heritage sites now substitute or let's say they are alternatives to going to the seashore or going to the mountains for skiing. There's something that people do on holiday or on the weekends. And this is a very dangerous strategy of trivialization. And like so much in our world, where revenue and the bottom line dictates everything, it's a real danger to heritage, not only because the message is often very trivial and the focus is on selling things, but because we get a very different idea of what the importance of heritage is, and it very rarely gets the revenue that is anticipated, and so causes other kinds of economic problems.
Thank you very much. It seems like we have more questions. And the third question comes from Canada, from 𝐕𝐵𝐴Z𝐵. And the question is, what is the new book you just referred to? This is the end of the question.
The new
What
book.
is the new book you just referred to? And it appeared after, I think, the presentation, or maybe at the end of the presentation. So I can't help you, Professor. I don't remember this particular moment you referred to this book.
Well, since this is the reading corner and I can't remember what I mentioned, I will toss out two books that people should look at. One is called Participatory Action Research, which is about methodologies that basically combine what has been done at the Poznan Heritage Center. But for those that aren't so familiar with participatory action research, I recommend it highly. It's the first author's name is 𝐕𝐵𝐴Z𝐵, Alice 𝐕𝐵𝐵𝐴Z𝐵. But that's one book, which is a sort of handbook. The other book that I urge people to read is called Curated Decay by Caitlin DeSilve, who basically explains the difficulty in our normal ideas of conservation and preservation, and how we can have a new approach to that and to interpretation.
Professor, the good news is that we've got the comment from 𝐕𝐵𝐴Z𝐵, and she said that the book with the quote about creating a community, not an audience.
Oh, yes. Yes, it is. I think that is the title. This is about how nonprofit organizations and NGOs can survive in this world. And I believe that the title is exactly that: community, not audience. And it is it's a very interesting read about how a nonprofit organization or an NGO goes about cultivating that community.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question is from Ola Ha or Ola Cha. I don't know who is it. Do the presented strategies, these strategies you presented, or so to say management approaches, exclude each other, or could they be combined? It seems,
absolutely.
It seems to me, Ola added, that some could be combined with one dominant perhaps, but maybe not. So this is this question.
I think that I mentioned that briefly, but it's good to stress it again. Any kind of interpretation that is focused on a single message is not going to work. And all these different strategies that I mentioned have got to be sensitively combined. And what the combination is needs to be determined in conversation with the visitors, what the visitors are interested in. Is no sense to make a place into a relic where people see it as a curiosity. Of course, all of these are the variables in interpretation, and really, as I said, interpretation is a relationship between people. In fact, the famous scholar of heritage, Laura Jane Smith, has said there's no such thing as heritage. Heritage is what heritage does, so that theoretically anything can become heritage if it conveys or a message or multiple messages. And in our world of increasing individuality, people have different perspectives. So in all these strategies, it's really a question that the interpreter has got to listen as much as organize and talk.
Thank you very much. In the meantime, Professor Michał Pawleta thanked you for the answers. And there is also from Olaha, who appeared to be Aleksandra Habiera, National Institute of Cultural Heritage Poland. She also thank you, Professor, for the answer. Heritage is what heritage does, indeed, she added. There is no question in my chat box, but maybe we've got the audience here in the room, so maybe someone would like to ask the question. There is only this opportunity asking Professor Silbermann live here. So I don't see any people who want to raise their maybe address. So I would say, Professor, that your presentation, we can see it as the great framework for another presentation, which will go into details of your speech. And I think that the next presenters will easily address the issues you raised during their presentation. So I would like to thank you again for being with us here. It was an honor to hear you here in Poznań with this windy, rainy weather, which appeared to be very positive, because it's when there is a dynamic weather, we can think deeper or much easily. So you prepared for us the good brain food for next presentations. So I invite you to stay with us and listen to the other presentation, and also ask questions during the presentation to the presenter, and I will be happy to read it to another presentators. Thank you, Professor. And now we can open the floor to the next presenters, and the next presenter will be Helena Vicic, who represents Interpret Europe. So our guest and our partner, strategic partner of this conference from Slovenia. A few words about Helena. Helena gained her experience as heritage interpreter, cultural product coordinator, projects coordinator, and also tourism advisor. And now she is the managing director at Interpret Europe, European Association for Heritage Interpretation from Slovenia. And her presentation will be titled as follows: Interpret Europe, Perspective on Heritage Values. And I think that it will be the special also note for us. Thank you, Helena, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It was a pleasure to listen to Mr. Silbermann's presentation. You've touched upon several aspects of, or let's say, points of interpretation, and some of them I will also try to develop further, perhaps, or broader, depends. Yes, thank you to colleagues in Poland to invite us, to invite Interpret Europe. We gladly accepted the invitation to cooperate or to support the conference, because discussing values in heritage interpretation is very, very important, maybe more than we think, especially due to the fact that also Mr. Silbermann mentioned the trivialism and fun and entertainment being the main drivers or the main concern of many interpreters. But I believe we can and we shall be more ambitious in what we're doing. Yes, what I've been meaning to emphasize is that, and also Mr. Silbermann mentioned again, thanks for this introduction, that interpretation is not a one-way, shouldn't be a one-way communication, but a participatory process, and that people should actually interpretation is a process that happens within people with their inner being, right? And as we know, people are complex beings. We are not just rational beings or, you know, intellectual beings, but we are also spiritual and soulful beings. We have senses, we have all sorts of aspects that should be addressed by interpreters. So yes, one-way communication certainly doesn't tackle all of them. And another aspect that I would like to emphasize, I will not so much touch upon the values that are intrinsic to heritage, but more on human values. Because if we, like interpreters, are more and more discussing, pardon, our role in renegotiating our values, our development as a society, where we want to go, and also we want to, like, we might want to open up issues like climate change or social contemporary changes, as also the presenter before me mentioned. All right, so we say that interpretation or a meaning making happens within this triangle. At Interpret Europe, we use this triangle to depict how interpretation happens. And interpreters on the left, as you see, should be able to help to connect people with heritage, no matter what this heritage is. And if this communication runs in all directions, and by which, or with it, by, yeah, which it fulfills certain criteria, this is how interpretation happens. This is the recipe for it. I would not delve deeper into at this point into those qualities, but the main quality criteria for us criterion is to get people in direct touch with heritage and to foster a dialogue. When we say direct touch, we try to emphasize how important it is to get people involved with all senses. And due to the increase in digitalization and all the funds that are going now into the digitalization, especially by European Union, probably in other continents as well, we are rather critical towards this development. We are not entirely sure. Like, we would say that digital means are very valuable as a supplement, not as a supplement, as a complementary means. But this first-hand experience should be really a sort of a paramount of an experience of heritage, if we want to achieve the goals that we are talking about today. And if this process fosters certain values, so those are the, I'm talking about human values. This process has been called by UNESCO, namely Regional Office in Venice, as a value-based interpretation. Last year, throughout some collaboration that we had, they said this is it, value-based interpretation. In general, we use values to connect people with heritage, and by doing that, we use basic human values such as freedom, courage, family, home, belonging, self-development, care, security, and so on and so on. These are the values that every citizen of this world could, to some extent, relate to. It touches those, let's say, universal values. Touch almost every one of us, and that's why we use this. We insert those values in interpretation and build upon them in order to get close to connect people with heritage. And of course, then are also the values on collective level. As a society, we should constantly reevaluate our collective values in order to see where we're going or where we want to go as a society. Let me proceed. Interpreters could or should foster this process based on heritage. This is what we have, right? Heritage is our anchor, our roots, and as such, it matters a lot to us. So if we open up a dialogue based on encounters with heritage, you heard probably that museums are safe spaces for unsafe discussions, and this is what basically refers to all heritage. It is in many cases, especially historical events, can be already enough distant in order to open up sensitive subjects. Okay, let's just have a look at what we've agreed in European Union. This is from the EU Treaty, and these are the values that European Union stands on or was built upon, and those are dignity, respect, rule of law, solidarity, equality, diversity, pluralism, tolerance. Would that be perhaps something that interpreters could build upon, interpretation? Would that be something we should open a discussion about with people and get them involved into these considerations? That doesn't mean that we need to become political or to become like campaigners for one or another option, far from that. But that we should, offer such considerations. You know, people will yeah, if people get involved, not being actually lured into one or another option, they will think we need to trust that people are able to think on their own for themselves. Of course, everyone will get out of such a discussion whatever is like whatever they are ready for, right? And we cannot claim to have influence on the, or let's say, to determine what the outcome of that would be. But this is all a process, and we should trust that this process would help all of us to rethink certain aspects of our lives. All right. So how values work would be the question. I'm not sure whether you've come across, I'm sure you have, this human value circle by Shalom Schwartz, who found out that human values could be distributed across and around this circle, and that when they were doing this research, I will show you right now. They have produced a sort of a map of values, like, yeah, from wisdom, justice, spirituality, down to wealth, authority, social power, like all sorts of values. And these values can be grouped up. For example, if one highly cherishes unity with nature, that person would very likely highly rank also the neighboring values, like a world of beauty, a world of peace, and broad-mindedness and equality. And the opposite, if one highly values wealth and authority, that person would most probably chose also preserving my public image or social recognition as important to them. And so they've realized that Western societies although they tend to be like very much in this bottom left corner, wealth, authority, social power, influence, success, ambition, and to the right, obedience, national security, and so on. There is also a tendency in Europe to strive towards those broad-mindedness, equality, unity with nature, and so on, freedom. We all possess all values somehow. It depends on the life period, depends on the situation we are currently in, or even during the day, those values change for all of us. So it's not that, one are extremely negative or extremely positive. This is a mix. But nevertheless, there are patterns and there are values that drive us strongly than other values. And now, if we're talking about preservation of nature, of culture, at the first place, the people that strive towards that can be more found in this upper top part of this map, in universalism, self-direction, benevolence values. So the question is, if we want to influence our society through heritage, how can we foster those green universalism and benevolence values rather than achievement and power values? And of course, heritage can be a very good base for that. So this is now the circle again. Just as before, it's just compressed in the clear titles. So good news is that we can really work with values in heritage interpretation. And this is what we've been dealing with this. You will later hear Patrick Lenez, one of the presenters, elaborating more on this related to politics. But what I want to say here, or share with you here, is that we've dealt with, at Interpret Europe, we've dealt with this 3-4 years ago, with this circle, with the values, when we were actually asked how we can contribute to European project and European values. And we published the Engaging Citizens paper, Engaging Citizens with Europe's Cultural Heritage. We've elaborated on this values circle, what are the rules in this circle, how these values work, and you can find it out. You can free download the publication from our website. This publication was recognized and awarded by European Union with Altiero Spinelli Prize. So our colleague Thorsten Ludwig, my former co-director, has written this study. I also want to mention that. This publication contains also case studies, real-life case studies, how those values, European values, could be fostered with heritage interpretation, what stories work, and so on.
Helena,
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting you, but 3 minutes left. Okay,
all right.
Let's keep it.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so the last chapter I wanted to point out is that, like, how to work with people, or not just how. Mr. Silbermann explained this very nicely, but mindfulness, this is another concept we're dealing at the moment, and this is not new. Mindfulness is not like a meditation practice or anything. This is an awareness of self, of others, of the planet, and this is quite an old concept by Gianna Moscardo in the 90s. She's researched that. And this is what we've came up with. Mindfulness of ourselves could be somehow equals, or I will proceed because in order to not lose time. Mindfulness of ourselves could be some sort of parallel with economic pillar of sustainability, mindfulness of others, equity, justice, and mindfulness of the planet, preserving of livelihood and ecology, and how to foster mindfulness, and why should we interpret this, do that? Because other segments of our system do not deal with that. Education more strives towards employability, whereas mindfulness means to develop this prefrontal cortex of our brain, where these functions are somehow situated. And these functions are also empathy, intuition, morality, response flexibility, and so on, and communication. And this is, as I said, hardly anyone fosters those aspects in people. And in children as well. So this is an opportunity for us interpreters to deal, to actually offer this service, so to say, to the people. Okay, this is again our triangle. What the quality standards of interpretation that Interpret Europe stands for and advocates for, and this is just Yeah, if multiple senses are included in experience, if people see, hear, smell, and move at the site, if they are encouraged and have an opportunity to reflect and to exchange, they link more information to different areas of their brain. And this is again fostering prefrontal cortex. And therefore later people can better recall and apply in different situations. And just the final thought, heritage interpretation can offer an approach to make people more mindful towards heritage and towards our common future by fostering values and encouraging critical considerations, as a sum up to all what we've said by now. But yeah, I hope I managed to highlight how we see values, how we work with them, and by our training program, we try to teach, we teach and train guides, planners, writers on the field to actually equip them with these tools to do just that on the field.
Okay, thank you very much for this mindful presentation. I think we can also... Okay, thank you very much for this viewpoint from Slovenia. There is a question, so I will read it from Bill Bevan. I think I hope I said it correctly. It is a good to hear an interpreter who understands the participatory and enjoyment natures of good interpretation. Bill noted, and added the questions. Can you elaborate on your idea that visitors participate in interpretation? Do you see visitors as active agents in creating meaning through the interpretation of a heritage site?
Yes, yes, definitely. It's how should I elaborate on that? There's many aspects to it. If people, like one of the aspects is that if people are actively involved in something, they would take ownership over the outcome of this process and responsibilities as well. So if we want to, include this behavioral change goal, or this is the way that they take part in the process and take ownership. So this is one aspect. The other is that all the educational, not all, I would say all, but many contemporary educational theories emphasize how important it is for learning aspect, that people are involved with all senses, that they take part, and so also learning improves, not just this belonging and affiliation to whatever is happening, or to the site, or to the process, heritage itself. So whatever we want to achieve, it is so much better and efficient if we involve people. And nevertheless, heritage is it belongs to them, right? It's their domain. So who are we to tell what they should think about it, or what meanings should they make?
Yes, who are we? Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, we know the significance, right? This professional aspect, but then if we want to get them attached, emotionally involved, it shouldn't be us to tell.
Yes, you are right. I think that this question is in mind. Who are we? Is in mind in the mind of every heritage interpreter. Yes, to know his or her role in what they are doing. Thank you very much, Lena. We have to hurry up a little, so I don't see the question. I have some, but I am the one who should say enough. So
I'm very happy to answer any question by email or
Okay, thank you very much, Helena. And now we are going to the South Africa. I would like to welcome Dr. Clinton David van der Merwe from University of Pretoria. Clinton is a senior lecturer and teaches geography education in the Department of Humanities Education at the Faculty of Education of the University of Pretoria. And with over 15 years he has 15 years of teaching experience. And I would like to add, Clinton, what you added in the last sentence. He is also an avid park runner. So this is very interesting. So David will be talking about very important question. And when I read this abstract, I knew that I have to listen to this presentation. It's about contested heritage. Whose heritage do we value the most? So it will be the case study, very interesting, from South Africa. Clinton, the stage is yours.
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity of joining you, the only Southern Hemisphere perspective in today's proceedings. But I'm very glad to be here and honored. Thank you for this opportunity. So my paper is a work in progress, and it stems from some work that I was doing from the PhD. I'm interested in battlefield tourism, or what we call historical or dark tourism, thanatourism. And one of my case studies was looking at battlefield tourism in South Africa. We, just to give you some context, have 10 World Heritage Sites in South Africa. And 5 of those are classified as cultural sites. 4 of them are natural heritage sites because of the fauna and flora and majestic beauty of our landscape. And then 1 of those is considered a mixed site because it's not just a beautiful mountain range, but it also has very important rock art paintings and things of cultural significance that we celebrate, which is called the Melotti Drakensberg Park. So just to set the scene, here are the 10 sites in South Africa, and you can see where South Africa is in the world there on my little insert map, bordered with a red border. The area that we're going to be mostly interested in talking about today is in the KwaZulu-Natal province, where there's a lot of battlefields that are obviously historical heritage sites because of the various role players in our history. People think we are a very young country, but we do have about, nearly 500 years of history in terms of what's modern day recorded, although we go back in time to many more thousands of years prior to that. So just to set the scene, as it were, South Africa is a very multicultural country. A lot of what I'm going to say in the next couple of slides needs to be said to contextualize some of my claims and the argument that I'm going to try and make. We have a 12 official languages policy. So you can see we speak a lot of languages in this country. And we are about nearly 60 million people, according to one of the latest census figures there from the World Bank. I've put this little graph on here just to show you our cosmopolitan nature, because we're made up of various race groups. And even in terms of race, most of those population groups are different ethnic groups of indigenous people that would have been here way back in time. You can see the majority of our population are African people, and then we have coloreds or mixed race, white, as well as Indian or Asian folk. And we make up a very diverse nation, as Mr. Nelson Mandela once said, the Rainbow Nation. To make it, just to put things into context, let me share a little bit of our brief history, because it'll contextualize the case study quite nicely. Various indigenous people have made up and lived in South Africa from between 3.3 million and 100,000 years ago. And those people have obviously roamed the landscape over time. About 2,000 years ago, the Khoikhoi people, who were predominantly pastoralists, lived in the region that was discovered by the white European settlers in the southwestern regions of South Africa, what we call Cape Town or the Western Cape Province. And the San, which were also indigenous people, were hunter-gatherers, roamed most of the inland areas of the Northern Cape and the interior of the country. Jan van Riebeeck, the Dutch discoverer who worked for the Dutch East India Company, arrived on the 6th of April, 1652, and discovered the Cape, in inverted commas there, because it was from that point on that the European influence in South Africa was established. And with that, the advent of slavery and the use of slaves in our history also became predominant. From the 1770s, various colonialists, be it British or Portuguese and the Dutch, as well as the Bantu-speaking or indigenous people, became involved in lots of conflicts and warfare over land and resources. The 1820 British settlers arrived in Algoa Bay, and you know the history we have of being a colony of the British Empire. Shaka Zulu, one of the chief role players in South Africa's history, was a Zulu king, and he also played a role in bringing about various conflicts and the battle for land and resources in what we call the Mafekane, a process whereby he displaced and moved various African language-speaking people across the country into various places. The tribal warfare that ensued across the country throughout the early periods of the 1800s is essentially what sets up this interest of mine with battlefield and heritage tourism. Culturally and heritage tourism is a big thing in South Africa, and we know that our engagement with minerals such as diamonds and gold, the Anglo-Boer War or South African War that happened, our whole history with being under the dominion of the British Empire, and then eventually having Black resistance and African passive politics is what brought us to that terrible scourge of our history, which is the horrible experience of apartheid and separate development. Throughout time, we've had repression, resistance, defiance, and the whole liberation struggle is a big focus of what we're trying to market in our tourism strategies in encouraging cultural and heritage tourism to grow in South Africa so that people can understand our history and our fight for freedom and democratic rights and a new democracy. Reform started in the late 80s, where we had some form of constitutional reform, and the white government started talking to the ANC and other African political parties in negotiating some sort of road forward in a peaceful negotiation of democratic leadership and governance. And you know that we celebrated our first national democratically elected ANC government in 1994, where Mr. Nelson Mandela became the first Black president of South Africa. And this is one of my heroes in South Africa, sadly not with us anymore, but you can see there from the photograph and the very apt quote that he made, that heritage and what we believe in society as South Africans is very important for us if we're going to take reconciliation forward. So my case study centers around an event known as the Battle of Blood River. This was a conflict, an armed military conflict, which ensued in 1838. And just to show you there an artist's impression of the actual skirmish, it was between the Boers and the Zulus. And along this river down here, which is called the 𝐸𝐵𝐸 River, is where they created this laager of their ox wagons to create a buffer and a fortification or a wall, as it were, to the advancing Zulus who had to cross the stream to get to them because they were laagered and protected here by the topography and the landscape to basically ensue this little conflict. So what happened is essentially Andries Pretorius and the Zulu king Dingaan had a disagreement, and there was this conflict between the Boers and the AmaZulu. You can see there the Boers were unfairly matched against the opposing force of the AmaZulu because they had guns and gunpowder, whereas the Zulus had only spears and shields made of animal hide. But be that as it may, on the 16th of December 1838, the skirmish unfolded in that region of South Africa along the 𝐸𝐵𝐻𝐸 River, which is now known as the Battle of Blood River in terms of battlefield technology. And on the 16th of December in 1838, you can see there the map on the left here of how the battle unfolded between the two opposing forces. Now, while I've chosen this as a case study to look at how we interpret heritage and what values and whose heritage we value the most, is a very important and contested concept. You know, with our racial history of apartheid in South Africa, there's still a lot of reconciliation and healing that needs to be done in our country, despite the fact that we've celebrated just over 28 or 27 years of democracy now, this last year, with the ANC government being in power since 1994. Then, if you have a look at some of these details, I'm not going to read through all of the stuff about the Battle of Blood River, but it just contextualizes what happened there on that fateful night along the 𝐸𝐸𝐻𝐸 River in KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa. The fur trackers were heading inland to go and look for land and resources to set up a republic or a place for them to make their mark and live. And they clashed with the local Zulu king Dingaan there, who obviously was very suspicious of these people arriving. And despite negotiations and interactions between the two nations, he instructed a force of between 10,000 and 20,000 Zulu warriors to go and meet the Afrikaans foot trackers, or the Boers, with violence. The 470 fur trackers had the advantage of gunpowder, like I said, and successfully warded them off. The battle began at dawn and was over by midday that day, the fateful day of the 16th of December 1838. And by that early afternoon, 3,000 Zulus lay dead, and the river was literally turned to blood. And that is why it's called the Battle of Blood River, because the 𝐸𝐸𝐻𝐸 River went from being water or blue to blood red, and shockingly terrible. Only three fur trackers, including their leader, Andries Pretorius, who I showed you there earlier, were wounded. Not a single Afrikaans or Boer killed. And the 𝐸𝐸𝐻𝐸 River became this huge victory in the Anglo-Zulu sort of war and the conflict that ensued for years to come after that. So to show you why this is contested and problematic, if we go to the next slide there, you can see this is a photograph of the Blood River Museum in Dundee, KwaZulu-Natal. And if you go and visit this on one side of the river, this essentially is the Afrikaans perspective, or the Afrikaner interpretation of that fateful event and battle. You park here along the sort of area there where the trees and the grass are, and then you go inside this little building, which is the museum. And essentially, even though there are representations of the Zulus and implements and relics and pictures and all sorts of historical material, essentially this is a interpretation or a perspective of this event from the Afrikaans or the voortrekker view. Years later, after democracy in 1994, it was brought to the attention that heritage had to be seen from everyone's perspective. And so on the other side of this river, yeah, you can see, before we go to that, the next picture is the laager of the various ox wagons that they used to make that protective circle around their encampment. And this now today is memorialized there through these bronze, very expensive and very ordinate representation of the laager there on the one side of the river. But literally across the river, the 𝐸𝐸𝐻𝐸 River, if you go to the other side now, in the next picture there, you can see in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, the Zulu's perspective of this fateful event and battle is now represented and memorialized in what is known as the 𝐸𝐵𝐵 Museum. And you can see there from this aerial shot that the museum building is a very modern structure there, with all the artifacts and the relics and the historical information, photos, pictures, etc., as well as the Zulu huts of that little Zulu village along the one side over there. So just literally less than 2 kilometers away from the Afrikaner perspective on the other side of the river is a different but a Zulu-orientated interpretation of what that fateful battle was all about, and who caused it, and how it happened, and what the outcome was. So the next picture there just shows you the entrance hall to that 𝐸𝐵𝐵 Museum, the gate. They are literally only 3 or 4 kilometers apart, these two different installations or two different institutions, but the one is from the Afrikaner perspective and the other one is from the Zulu perspective, literally in the same region, but two different museums trying to portray the same event, but obviously from different perspectives. So if you go into the 𝐸𝐵𝐵 Museum, this is what it looks like inside some of the installations, where you can see a Zulu warrior there with his shield and spear. And then from all the information boards, like most museums, you have to read a lot, and you see some of the detail and some of the narrative relating to this historical battlefield and event. From the other side of the perspective, if we go back over the river in this next photograph, you'll see what it looks like in the Blood River Museum on the other side, where the different ox wagons are. And this is inside their building, where you're obviously seeing some of the relics. And even though there is an attempt to represent the Zulu perspective there, you can see a Zulu hut in the corner of the building there. Most of the attention and the emphasis is placed on the Boer perspective and how this is part of their heritage and their struggle. So to try and bring peace to this situation, the national government of South Africa tried to compromise, and you can see in the last photograph over there, a bridge was built between the one heritage museum from the Afrikaner perspective on the one side of the river towards the other side, so that you can go and reach and walk from either the one to the other, to go and see the different perspectives and the different museums are represented there. So to conclude, heritage remains very contested and very politicized in this country. There's lots of reconciliation and renewal that we still need to work on and bring into effect. But it's a very important component of our history and our past, and we are using heritage as a lever for tourism, because cultural and heritage tourism is very important in South Africa. The government has attempted to reconcile the two accounts of these events by building that bridge, but is a bridge enough? And could one not argue, and this is the point of the argument that I'm trying to make, is that if we had one renewed or coalesced representation of this event in a new museum, would that not be more democratic and more sort of objective? Although if we had to keep the two separate perspectives, why not make one entrance fee which is charged to visit both, and encourage the visitors to visit both of those by using that specific bridge? Tourist guides are also often very subjective, and they only give the perspective from one point of view. And the Department of Arts and Culture needs to consult more widely and consider the effect, whether or not memorials are valuable as a memorial, if only from one perspective. We need to be more objective and look at things from both sides of the coin to make it more sort of democratic and value everyone's heritage equally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, for this interesting presentation, and also the sounds at the background were beautiful. So thank you for that. I can't see the questions online now, but I've got the question, because you concluded more with questions and not the answers, which is obvious because the topic is not so easy to deal with still, and that's why you just put this historical framework very in not fragmented, but in very detailed way to just put us in the context, in the right context. But
Mhm.
I would like to ask the question that you asked in the abstract, because I would like to know your opinion if there is a time for it, but maybe you want to leave it as the question. So the question is it right to have separate memorials based on one particular heritage, or should we find a compromise that details history from both perspectives in a more objective manner? What is
Mm.
your answer? I think this answer is not so easy.
No, thank you. My personal opinion is that we should build a new museum where we amalgamate the two. We can keep all the artifacts of the previous one, which was there for many more years compared to the Zulu one, which is a more recent phenomenon. It's only been there for about 4 or 5 years now. And if you amalgamate all the artifacts and the relics, and you then just, through the help of a very talented and skilled curator, and through public participation and getting various people involved from both perspectives, put it together in a new installation, it would make far more sense to me. Much like what we did in the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, where the whole story of apartheid is told from everyone's perspective, including from those white people who were not aware of what was happening because they were so shielded by the news that was controlled and the television. We only saw what the government wanted us to see, as it were, although, I mean, I wasn't alive in those days. I'm a post-apartheid sort of person. But I think we need to just make it more objective and bring everyone's perspective in so that we make it equal. Otherwise, you're going to still perpetuate this issue of, whose heritage is more important compared to the other one. And it's not right. It's not fair. And in today's modern times, heritage and history is important. We have to learn from our mistakes, and we have to move forward and value our culture and our heritage going forward. Ongoing research. So I'm still going to answer that, I hope.
So we are waiting for the results. I see the question coming, I think. Oh, yes. There is a question from the audience. Do you need this museum for temporary politician goals?
The new one.
I think so.
The Zulu, yes, the Zulu Noma is a new installation. Obviously, when we became a democratic South Africa, the fact that there was only one museum portraying the Afrikaans or the Boer perspective meant that the Zulu perspective was silenced or non-existent. And so I think that is why the new government did build it and sanctioned it for political purposes, but not just to correct the wrongs of apartheid and the wrong view of whose heritage is more important, but to give everyone, to give the Zulus a voice, as it were, despite the fact that it wasn't one cohesive heritage site. It's now two, essentially. The problem is the Afrikaans side is privately controlled, whereas the Zulu Museum is a government or a state institution. So there's this big problem between private ownership and public ownership, which is a huge issue as well.
Thank you very much. My conclusion is that heritage interpretation has the power to change the world step by step, but this power is visible here. So, Clinton, thank you very much for your presentation. We are waiting for the results of your research. I think that you will share it with us, but there is some questions appeared at the end of my okay. Alexandra Abiera from National Institute of Cultural Heritage Poland has a question, or just a note. I will read it. Fun fact for a context. True crime fans can thaw Africa better than average, as there is a podcast run by a Polish woman. and she always gives historic and or social context on the crimes. So some of us may know a little, but I think is big or bad, more than average in Poland. And I have to say that we deal with dissonant or difficult heritage in Poland, but your country have, I think, more recent issues. Heritage can deal with it, but it really depends on the policy and the knowledge. So how do you deal with difficult heritage on a central level? It is a very difficult issue. It is a very difficult issue. So the question is, how do you deal with difficult heritage on a central level?
Well, I'm sure you know the history of our country. When Nelson Mandela became president, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where most of the evils of apartheid and all the bad things came out into the public and for the world to know. I think we need to have a reconciliation commission for heritage, dissonant heritage, and reconciliation across all population groups in South Africa, and how we can bring our histories together, despite the fact that it was very painful and hurtful for some, and where other people obviously benefited unfairly and grossly. I think it's through public participation and involvement of all stakeholders. We need to get around a round table and talk to one another and solve the issues through compromise and through obviously deliberation and talking to one another.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Clinton, for the
Thank you.
presentation. Best regards and have a good evening today. Thank you very much. Bye. And the next presenter will be 𝐕𝐵𝐴Z𝐵 from Calgary, British Columbia, Canada. Jackie, are you with us now? Yes, we have Jackie with us. Jackie, welcome to Poznań. I will add some sentences about you. Jackie has worked in the interpretation field for over 40 years, as she mentioned. She has worked with a variety of park and conservation-based agencies in interpretation-related position, lastly in Banff National Park, and now Jackie has been operating her own consulting company, Interactive Planning and Training. In 2015, she successfully defended her interpretation-based dissertation within the interdisciplinary Doctor of Social Sciences program at Royal Roads University in British Columbia. And Jackie is with us to just deliver the speech titled From Information to Inspiration. Jackie, we are happy that you are with us. The floor is yours. Jackie, you have to just mention your mic. Turn on your mic, please.
Yes, okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, I turned it on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Right. Okay, I just get my screen share back again. Thank you very much. While I'm waiting for my screen share, I want to say thank you for including me in this session. And on the west coast of Canada. And so it is morning for us. And so while I'm waiting for my slide to come up, I just wanted to let you know that I actually live on Vancouver Island on the west part of Canada. and I am living on what is the unceded territory of the Comox First Nations people. And I am honored and thankful to be able to live where I do. So thank you. Thanks for inviting me. And I would like to talk to you about the whole idea of maybe interpretation moving from being information-based to being inspiration-based and what that might look like. So let's get going. So I know I only have 20 minutes. I wanted to do just a quick introduction to me and my background. And then I want to look at my inspiration interpretation framework with you. And then, of course, a quick wrap up and questions at the end. But I'd like to point out this quote by Freeman Tilden. I think many of you have heard of Freeman Tilden as a North American author on interpretation from the 1950s. He said, "We want to send the visitors away with something more than a fact, and we may call that something inspiration." So a bit about me. As our moderator mentioned, I've been involved in interpretation my whole career in Canada. And about 10 years ago, decided I wanted to do my doctorate or my PhD. And I wanted to study this field that I'd been involved in my entire career. So I did go to Royal Roads University here in Canada and studied the whole idea of inspiration in the field of interpretation. And I was very fortunate at the time to also be working for Parks Canada. And my manager invited me to use the ideas I was generating through my research in my work with my interpretive team. So I was very fortunate, and I'm very fortunate to consider myself a scholarly practitioner. So I've combined the theory of interpretation with practice in the field. And I do have to point out that my field has mostly been parks and protected areas, which it means I've mostly focused on natural heritage, but also, of course, cultural heritage has been included in that. And I have done a number of projects with national heritage sites here in Canada. And I did retire from Parks Canada a year or so ago and am now running my own company, which I call Interp-Active. So I know this conference is about values, so I wanted to give you a quick sense of what I value. So I value trying to think holistically. I value interpretation as a contributor to protection of both natural and cultural heritage. And I also value people as whole beings. And the idea that people bring a multitude of values, experiences, and knowledge to the interpretation experiences. And I like to describe this to my staff and clients as the empty vessel idea. People don't come to us as empty vessels waiting for us to pour a whole bunch of information in. They come with some liquid already in that vessel. You know, they already know some things. And our job as interpreters, I think, is to help pull that out. And of course, I value the whole idea of inspiration and all of its components, which I'm happy to share with you today. The end result of my research and my practice using the ideas in the practice of interpretation is this framework, which is quite detailed. And I just mention it or show it to you here because I'm going to break it down in my presentation. But I wanted you to know that this is my overall framework, which is based on my values, my research, and experiences in practice. And it is available at my website if you want to get the whole infographic. So starting at the top of this framework, this was me in my research journey, trying to figure out what it was I wanted to study about this field that I have devoted my career to. And it came down to, in my mind, this idea that interpretation is like a tethered hot air balloon. I don't know if you've seen them at fairs and such, but beautiful hot air balloon, but it's tethered to the ground. I kind of felt like the field of heritage interpretation was like that. It was tied down. It wasn't doing as much as it could do. And so I kind of started with that idea. So I said, well, what is the issue? Came down to this idea that I think our field has been too focused on education and information sharing. And I ended up labeling this reductionism. And excuse me, when I think about reductionism, I think about these ideas, right? That we're too focused on breaking all the little bits down, right, of our sites. And maybe too much based on the theme that we as interpreters want to share with our visitors, maybe too focused on the individual agency, and on, oh.
Jackie, everything is
Oh,
okay.
okay, sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm not sure what you're asking me to do.
No,
In this mode here? Oh, okay. Okay. Where was I here? Okay. Okay, so leave it in this mode? Okay, okay. I know it's not the normal mode for presenting, but okay. So anyway, okay, so the idea of, in my mind, was that the reductionist era in interpretation was, say, over the last 100 years, and the focus was interpretation for visitors and not with visitors. So I started looking at what was in the literature, of course, and came up with a number of articles that showed there were changes happening in the interpretation field, more towards what I would call the holism end of things. And in the holism side, which I'm showing in my graphic on the right, and the words on the graphic are shown on the left there, is this idea that interpretation can be, and people are advocating for the idea that it be more holistic and that we look more at our audiences, we invite emotions in, we question the role of information, we promote mindfulness. And in essence, this more holistic trend in interpretation, which Dr. Silbermann referred to as happening over the last 20, 30 years, and I would agree from what I found in the literature, was a push towards interpretation that's more with visitors and not for visitors. And I do have to say that I really enjoyed Dr. Silbermann's talk because I have read his articles, journal articles, and he's was referenced a number of times in my dissertation. So I know that my thinking fits in definitely with what he's got to say. So in terms of looking at the field as wanting to move from being reductionist to being more holistic, I was looking for something to research and came up with this idea that inspiration is a word that we use in interpretation, but we don't necessarily really pull it apart, I guess, and think about it in its details. And so that's what I studied. So I did look at this idea of inspiration in mainly in the psychology field, and came up with these 9 characteristics about inspiration when we think about what the term actually means, and put those there. The key one is this one at the bottom, which is this idea that people have to be open to being inspired, but that inspiration receptivity can be cultivated. And I think that's the job of interpreters, is to help cultivate the receptivity towards being inspired in our visitors. So what I did is I applied the ideas from the inspiration field to the heritage interpretation field. And I am proud to say that I did do participatory action research for my dissertation. And so I involved the interpreters from across North America in online discussions and dialogue about the whole idea of inspiration and what it meant to them and what it meant to their work. Came down to this little kind of graphic here, which I will break apart for you in a second, but it came down to this idea, first of all, that the center of this inspirational swirl is this idea that people are inspired at different levels. I call them the entry points to inspiration. People are inspired through their head, their heart, and their hands. And that's really just an acknowledgement that not everybody comes to interpretation for information. Some do, but some people come more because they want to be inspired at an emotional level, and some come because they want to be engaged. So when I pointed these things out to my interpreters, they really appreciated that idea that their programming could be about trying to reach people as whole beings. The other main aha moment I had in my research was this idea that inspiration actually breaks down into 2 sides, right? People are inspired by something and they're inspired to something. And I'd like to take a look at those 2 sides with you now. So first of all, the entry points I mentioned, the whole idea of heads, hearts, and hands. And I use that phrase a lot with my staff and clients. And so then inspired by. So the discussions with my research participants seem to boil down to these 3 categories of what people are inspired by. So we know people are inspired by people. And one of the things that came out of the research for me was this idea that people can be inspired, of course, by the interpreter. We know that, but they can also be inspired by each other. And as a social scientist, I'm always looking for ways that we can engage people with each other, right? And get them talking and learning and inspiring each other. The second about places plus is this idea that, of course, people are inspired by the places they come to, our heritage sites, But I added the plus in there because we wanted to acknowledge that it's not always about the place, right? Sometimes it's about the idea of the place or objects at the place or people from the past or historic events, etc. So just broaden the idea that it's not just about one place. And then, of course, people come and get inspired by participating. So the side of being inspired through participating is one that I have focused a lot on in the last couple of years in terms of my training, because this is the idea that our other presenters have talked about, which is really getting our visitors to engage and participate in the interpretation experiences. So I ended up breaking it down into 10 types of participatory interpretation. And the last one, the bottom one there about the idea of dialogue, is a big, not issue, it's a trend, I would say, in North American interpretation right now, is this idea of involving people in dialogue. And so my little mountain there is this idea of building them up from having small talk and nice, easy conversations to activity talk where they're participating, and then into deep talk where they're getting in more depth into a topic, but not expecting to jump right into deep talk with people, that you need to make them feel comfortable and build up to it. So I want to share a couple of examples, or a few examples with you from this idea in practice. So on the top left, we have two groups, a woman and a man on the one side and the family on the other. And in this case, what they're doing is they're sharing stories with each other. So these are all visitors at the interpretive event. They've heard stories from the interpreter about the past and the people who used this area in the past. And now they're sharing their stories about the place that they're visiting. And so the couple on the left, they've chosen to interview each other as their technique of interpreting their story for the other visitors. So I loved this program my interpreters came up with, because what it does is it turns the visitors into interpreters. And the top left picture is on a guided hike. And at this stop, they're doing the geologic timeline. They always do the geologic timeline at this stop. But what my interpreters started doing to make it more participatory is have two teams there. They've got some props there. They're laying out the geologic timeline for themselves. And it's a bit of a competition between teams. They always figure out the timeline because, as I mentioned at the beginning, people don't come to programs as empty vessels, right? They know what the geologic timeline includes, generally speaking. And then the interpreter kind of works with the two groups to help them with the information. So the interpreters mentioned that whenever they do something like this, on this guided hike, the visitors are way more engaged and they're way more chatty with each other and learning from each other way more than if the interpreter just stood and delivered the information. The bottom one is an example at the beginning of a program where the interpreter has just asked everybody to line up based on how many times they've come to this place, like how much experience they have with the place. So it's a nice, easy way to get people participating that just starts the activity, starts the program off with a little participation and getting people talking a little bit, even if it's to people within their own group. And I have to point out that the idea of involving people in participation, especially dialogic interpretation, has to fit with your audience, right? If your audience might be shy and not necessarily interested, you need to use techniques that will make them feel comfortable. So the other side of the inspiration framework is this idea of what people are inspired to. And my feeling in interpretation, at least from practice, was that interpreters were not always giving enough attention to this idea of what do they want people to do after, or what do people want to do after? What are they going to take away and do later? And so it ended up, I was able to break this into these three ideas that we could inspire people to take action at the site. And that's typically the things the agency wants people to do, right? Like to take care of the site. But then there's this idea of action after that we could be inspiring people to. And that's the broader, more holistic look at the world to say, well, what might people be able to do at other sites that would help the world in general? And then there's this one that's more of a change in being, or just a non-action, just a quiet, reflective change. And that's one that's more oriented towards what's of value to the visitor. And so I would always encourage my interpreters to consider not just what we as an agency wanted visitors to do, but get the visitors talking about what are they inspired to do after that's going to benefit them. So I want to share a couple of examples with you as well of that. So when we talk about inspiring people to take action at the site or after, the picture on the left shows you a map of a long, narrow park. And the idea there is to encourage people to stop and check out other places in the park instead of just driving through. And there's actually an invitation there to take a photo of that as a map and use it to guide their discovery of the rest of the park. So actions that will encourage them to explore more of the site. The top right picture there is at the end of a program about wildlife, and the visitors have been working in these small groups throughout the evening, and now they're just asked to commit to doing something. So what action will they take after? And so they generally say things like, well, we'll keep our distance from wildlife, or we won't feed the wildlife, things that people know that they shouldn't do. But in this case, they're committing to doing them, and in return, they're getting a little gift of a postcard. And then on the bottom right, this one is to do with salmon in our rivers out here, which we're always trying to reintroduce the salmon into the rivers. And so in this case, the sign is inviting people to go and find out more about the group that's involved and to join that group or join other groups. So something that they could do after that's not necessarily specific to that site. So taking a more holistic view of what people could do after. And then that side of inspiring people to just be, the top left here, this young girl with the beautiful hair is actually writing out what Canada means to her on one of those little sticky notes, sticking it up on the tree for others to look at. So that's inspiring people to just stop and ponder and put their ideas there and read what each other have written. And the bottom right is a Parks Canada initiative called the Red Chairs. And in this case, red chairs like this are placed at various sites all across Canada. And they invite people to just sit and look at the view. And whenever I was involved in one of these projects, I made sure that we put a little interpretive sign on the table that's between the chairs, something that just gave them a really tiny bit of information, but mostly that encouraged them to sit and reflect and think about a question. So to encourage them to be inspired to just be. When I think about inspiration as an idea, it became really clear that we needed to think about different audiences in interpretation. So we know we have the visitors, they're our main audience, of course, and so we need to consider things like the idea of idea, which is considering that our audience is no longer a homogenous group, everybody's the same. Realize that we have to consider inclusivity, diversity, equality, and accessibility, among other things, right, in terms of being able to inspire our visitors. We also, if we think about our organizations, they need to be inspired too, right? And one of the ways they need to be inspired is to be considering the broader world, the more holistic world, and not just their own sites. And then lastly, if we want to be inspiring our visitors, of course, we have to keep our interpreters inspired. And one of the ways I've done that with my staff is to really stress this idea of a growth mindset and encouraging my interpreters to constantly be changing and growing and trying new things. And my staff loved that because it felt freeing to them. Okay, so getting towards the end of this framework, or the end of what was my research journey and my thinkings about inspiration, is this idea of the interpretation as a tethered hot air balloon. Of course, we'd love to see that hot air balloon be free to fly, right? And so there are many ways that we could do that. And I guess what I'm advocating is the idea that we move from more reductionist thinking to more holistic. And we think about that from these different perspectives, and that we use these ideas that make up the concept of inspiration to guide us. And so there's the whole framework back together again. You can see the little journey there. And I guess one of the things I wanted to say was that when I was looking at putting this session together, I was wondering where my topic would fit. And it came to my mind that this fit within the idea of reconsidering our philosophical base, right? That what we do. And I think that's what I'm suggesting, is that over the last however many years, 100 or so years, interpretation has become kind of focused on information and that one-way delivery. The last 20, 30 years, there has been a shift to more holistic. And I'm saying that I think inspiration might have something to contribute to that, looking at the world and interpretation in a more holistic manner, whether we're talking about cultural or natural heritage. So I did take the ideas from my dissertation and from my practice with my interpreters and put them together into my book, which I've called Inspired to Inspire. Hope you'd like to take a look at that. And I do training and coaching now on these ideas, especially training in the dialogic interpretation and the more participatory interpretation, and really helping people come up with ideas for activities and dialogue and questions and techniques that will work for their own audiences. I do have a Padlet of resources, and Padlet was new to me, so I don't know if it's new to you folks or not, but it's basically a resource that's a free app where I have been storing any and all articles and videos and things that I've come across that fit with my thoughts and ideas, and you're welcome to check them out. They are free to just go on there and see if the resources are of use to you. And so my last slide, I just want to leave you with this thought, is that how I think we can help people be inspired to protect both natural and cultural heritage is that we need to aspire to inspire, not just to inform. And by inspire, again, I mean thinking of all those elements of inspiration that I've just gone through with you very quickly, and that interpreters need to see ourselves as facilitators of experiences and not just presenters of information. So I don't mean to disparage information. I realize it's part of what we do, but I think if we're trying to be more holistic and reach today's audiences and today's people and engage them in protecting of our resources, that we need to do some of these things and go beyond just information. And with that, that's the end of my
Yes, that's the end.
slides. I
Thank
hope
you.
you're ready for whatever happened at the beginning. I don't know.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for the presentation. Thank you. There are some questions, so I will
Okay.
read one. Okay. What do you think about the problem of horror vacui in new museums full of electronic toys?
Yes. Right. Okay. So if I understand right, you're talking about the problem of the electronics and the use of technology. Is that right?
Yes. What do you think about the problem of horror vacui? I mean, a fear or dislike of leaving empty spaces, especially in artistic composition. What do you think about this problem in new museums full of electronic devices and toys and so on?
Right. Okay. I'm not sure I'm understanding it, but I do acknowledge that our museums and science centers, et cetera, are full of the hands-on and things for people to manipulate, which from a participatory perspective, I think are great because from an inspirational perspective, they get people engaged, right? To a point, but I always like to say we need to have participation with purpose, right? So it shouldn't just be about manipulating. It needs to be about there being a purpose behind it, which is why I'm more in favor of dialogic interpretation, where we're inviting people to think and to talk and not just to manipulate, things in a museum. So if I'm back to the first part of your question, I'm not sure I understood it, but it was about people who are afraid to leave the spaces.
Wait.
No,
Okay.
sorry, I repeated. Horror vacui is in Latin language, meaning afraid the empty space. For example, in Renaissance, the artist would like to paint all the space on a canvas, for example, or the sculpture or something, and every empty space was full of different things. We have the same situation, I think, in our museums. We would like to show everything and put inside the museums a lot of electronic toys. And I think I have an example. For example, in Warsaw, we have a museum about the technology, a center of Copernic, and typical using for one toy in this museum is about 5 to 10 seconds only. One element in museums, and people use it for 5 to 10 seconds. No, 10 minutes, 10 seconds.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, I guess what I look at that as there's nothing wrong with empty spaces at all, right? So I think that sometimes less is more, and that in museums, one of the things we need to be doing is leaving more spaces so that there's room and time for reflection and not just quickly manipulating a toy and moving on to the next one. So, I think that's part of a mindset change, right? As far as encouraging more dialogue. And one of the things about dialogue that I find interesting is that a lot of times people think when we talk about dialogic interpretation, we're talking about trying to get strangers, to have to talk to each other. And human beings, we don't do that very well. So one of the things that I like is this idea of just getting dialogue going even within the group of people who came to the museum together, for instance, right? Because if you're getting them talking within their group, and one of my research participants said this really well. She said, if you've got them talking, this family group or friend group, you've got them. If you've got them talking, they go home and they talk over the dinner table about whatever the topic was at the museum that interested them. You've got them, you've inspired them, you've now had them change possibly their way of thinking. And so the empty space and encouraging people to stop and reflect and talk, even if just within their own group, I think are really powerful tools that go beyond just the manipulating of the toys, I think. I hope I answered that right in the end, or well for you.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Marek Nowacki. This is the online question. How to evaluate the effects of inspiration?
Yes. Thank you for that question. And I'm kind of chuckling because in my research participants, that became probably the top thing we talked about. So we talked about that interpreters would love to be inspiration-based and would love to focus on all these ideas of being more holistic and inspirational, but everybody has a manager who wants statistics and who wants evidence. And so, yes, so there's a long answer to that. I'll try to make it short. But what I came down to was the idea that, first of all, not everything has to be measured, right? Values, we can't measure values, right? And so there may be some things that we do where we cannot measure. And I think we have to accept that. I'm a qualitative researcher, not a quantitative researcher. So I am not as caught up necessarily in the numbers. So I think for starters, that came out of my research was that we don't have to measure everything, that maybe it's okay to have something that's not measurable, but that is a broad value that we want to base on. If we think about inspiration as our foundational base, we don't usually measure our foundational basis for what we're doing. So that was one thing that came out of it. The other thing that came out of it was this idea of maybe there are ways to measure and they would be quantitative. So things like repeat visitors or posts that people put up on social media after, or evaluation forms. And we give people evaluation forms at the end of programs and we say, what did this program inspire you to do after? We've got that evidence. It's not necessarily what they do after, right? We don't know for sure about behavior change or actions people take after, but at least we have the intent, right? If people say in an evaluation form they intend to do something, that's often the best we can get, because face it, we don't usually have the money to do longitudinal studies, right? To go back to people after and really find out what they did differently. But at least we can ask for intent, increase numbers of people in programs, that are maybe more engaging in dialogue. You could look at, so there are a number of quantitative ways that you can measure programming, maybe not necessarily inspiration per se, but maybe some of the elements.
Thank you for the answer. And Marek Nowacki, also thank you for very much, even for a very inspiring presentation. So I think he is a voice of our group. So we don't have much time to continue this discussion. So thank you very much again, Jackie, for the presentation. And now we need to move on to the next presenter, who is Patrick Lenez from University of Freiburg, Department for Environmental, Social Sciences and Geography. Patrick Lenez is a researcher and freelances as an interpretative planner. He investigates the philosophical and theoretical foundations of heritage interpretation, with a focus on practical implication for the prevention of populism, inclusiveness, and cultural diversity. I think that with this presentation, which is titled The Value of Ambivalence, Patrick will address many voices which were raised in the previous presentations. So I think that this is the good conclusion voice from Freiburg. Patrick, the floor is yours.
So, thank you very much for this nice introduction, and I am very happy to be able to speak here at an event which is taking place in Poland. So the picture you are seeing right now is from Poland, from Kraków, Nowa Huta, and it is from a memorial, the cross of Nowa Huta, which has an ambivalent story. I don't have the time to go into it, but
Patrick, I'm sorry for Oh yes, now we can see it.
Ambivalence is sometimes quite complex. So, what I so
okay, Patrick. Once again, we didn't see the picture you were talking about.
The title picture. Do you see?
Yeah, now we can see the title slide. Yeah, now.
Okay, and there is a pavement with stones.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Yes, and that's from Poland, from Kraków, from Nowa Huta.
Okay,
and
okay.
It is a
now
symbol.
We are with you. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry. So I will talk about some interim results of my research, and that's based on Erasmus Plus cooperation project funded by the European Union, which was called Delphi. I will take a slightly different perspective because I want to embed this in this presentation and the question of values and interpretation into the current situation, which has some pressing problems, challenges, like polarization in societies, which we can experience in many countries right now and also in Europe. And therefore, I start with a European Union Council resolution, the Council of Cultural Ministers, which is about the cultural dimension of sustainable development, which is maybe a bit surprising in the first place. And within this document, they state, among other things, that culture as a system of shared meanings within a community has an impact on how sustainable development measures are assessed by that community. I think that's quite a remarkable statement by a Council of Culture Ministers from 28 member states. And but it is important for us to take that seriously, because meaning systems that have an impact relates also to us and puts heritage interpretation, which interferes into meaning systems in some way, in a rather crucial position. And this statement continues. So culture subsequently can be a driver, is a driver for sustainable development that can mediate between different environmental, social, and economic concerns. That's quite a bold claim that culture is a driver for sustainable development, I think. We will come back to that later. It also refers directly to values and states that values are defining characteristics of humanity and cultures in their diversity and richness embody values and are sources of identity. And this cultures here means cultural meaning systems, of course. And by virtue of that, of which culture can have a transformative role as a creator of sustainability, promoting sustainable lifestyles and societies while enhancing quality of life. So these are very, very nice words. And I think most of us, all of us will agree that we have to transform our societies and lifestyles when we think about climate change, at least with a background of geography that's taken for granted in the meantime. So, but here's a caveat in this sentence, because it says culture can have such a transformative role. And can says that it is not necessarily the case, but that this is something contingent. And indeed, culture and subculture and their meaning systems can also inhibit transformation towards sustainability. Just think about the slogan, "Make America Great Again," which was trying to backtrack from already achieved change. And we have such movements in many parts of the world. So culture and the meaning systems they share do not necessarily have such a positive impact and are not necessarily a driver for change and transformation. And that's, I think, something we need to be very clear about. And this is, from this we can draw a first conclusion that cultures and subcultures, they include values as part of meaning systems for every individual, but also for collectives, as we had heard before, and that they are important for our future and how we will be able to transform our societies towards sustainability. And as heritage interpreters, we interfere into these systems by revealing meanings and relationships. So that's interpretation without this level is almost unthinkable, because if we go beyond mere information, we put things into perspective. So we have a responsibility towards society, how we deal with values. And here the value compass can be a useful tool. We have heard it's discussed more in depth in the Engaging Citizens publication by Interpret Europe. And I will discuss it more fully in the paper I want to write about this presentation. But right now, for this short presentation, I will focus on something else, another perspective, which is, what does it mean to have I have to start otherwise. Transformation to sustainability requires on this openness to change, which is on the one side, while tradition and conservation values on this side, conservation, tradition, oppose such changes. And this is a bit of a conflict for interpreters, especially when we look to the past, who were aiming to support preservation and conservation as their utmost value. So between these different sides. There is a tension because these openness to change values and conservation values, they are opposite of each other. And it's quite helpful to understand these relationships better. And there is one additional dimension which is not part of this value circle. It is that a value can become a non-value if it is overstated or exaggerated. So conservation can become something like inflexibility, stubbornness, and then it can turn what was positive before can turn into something negative. And I think as interpreters, we should also be aware of non-values when we want to be able to understand how our interpretations, what they make with visitors, and how visitors might react to what we present or what when we enter into a dialogue, how they might react to certain stories and ideas we convey to them. So non-values are, in contrast to values, they are negative guiding principles for all of us, and guiding principles of what to avoid, repudiate, or to disavow. And similar to values, non-values are abstract trans-situational criteria for judgments and decision-making. They are of varying importance for individuals or for cultural groups, and they are linked to our feelings and emotions. So the important thing is that both values and non-values provide guidance in our lives. If we look again at this, of course, on the other side, there are also non-values to openness to change, if that's exaggerated, like unsteadiness or carelessness. And what is of interest now for us is how these diagonals and these different dimensions, how they relate to each other within a meaning system and a value system. We have two different kinds of opposites we can see of a given value. Let's say the value of conservation. There is the complementary opposite on the one hand side with another value, which is also by definition something positive. A value is always something positive. And on the other hand, there is a relationship to what I called its adversarial opposite, which is the non-value that is related diagonally opposite to the value under consideration. And this goes both ways. But this model is simplification, and the real world is a bit more complex. And this matters for us and for interpreters, as we have heard that values within the value system of an individual or of a group that shares similar value system are of varying importance. And so it can be that the weight of one side shifts from, let's say, openness to change to conservation. And this has implications to the whole diagram, because as the one value here, conservation, becomes more dominant within a person's value system, this means that at the same time, the the counterbalancing value of openness to change becomes weaker. And it also means that within this person's or this group's value system, the non-values that are related to openness to change, that are that are deemed exaggerations, become more pertinent and more salient within their value system. This means that they can deflect something that could be considered as openness to change and something positive to these non-values. If we look what is a further consequence when this such a shift of weight gets more and more extreme, we can find something like an absolute value, and this means that that one value is taken so important, like openness to change. For let's think about some people who are really very much convinced about how important it is to change radically in the face of climate change. So this can then mean that the opposing value is more or less eclipsed. And they also never associate any criticism or anything. They would never accept criticism of their point of view because it's taken absolute. And they deflect any criticism with the non-values like inflexibility. So those people are just inflexible and stubborn. And by that, they immunize, inoculate themselves against criticism. So this results in a much simpler value system. If you have one which we take as absolute, and this is one of the reasons, maybe this simplicity, what makes populist positions so attractive for maybe many people, because it is simpler and easier to handle. But what does something like that mean for a society that is striving, as the European Union's motto is, for becoming united in diversity? You think for a moment, and also for a society that is striving for sustainability, which implies integrating environmental, social, and economic concerns, where you do not have this simplicity. So it's a rather obvious answer is that if you want to create a society that is united in diversity, this implies that we have to cope with competing values, and these may be of varying importance for different social and cultural groups who have different meaning systems. More or less different, more or less similar, but you have that's what makes cultural diversity also an important element of that. If you think back on what the Council of Ministers has written. And such a society requires permanent balancing and permanent rebalancing of their values, value priorities. And this implies what we had heard before, the openness for reflection and for quiet reflection reflective change and for changes of one's own being. So the same is true for a society under transformation towards sustainability and towards becoming more socially inclusive and united in diversity. So at the bottom line, in order to achieve this, such a society needs such a country or an area like a polity like the European Union needs the ability to deal with ambivalence. Now, what does this mean for interpretation? If we think about lifelong personal development, and that's reflection and changing and further developing one's own being, then this proverb is it's very helpful. That learning is like rowing upstream, not to advance is to drop back. And this might apply, this could be something what we can see these days with those so-called and sometimes left behind who tend to inhibit transformation of societies. They often feel themselves as left behind, and they can even cause backlash if they are not integrated and not included in our societies and in this reflective process that is so important for change. So from that background, heritage interpretation can contribute to foster people's ability to deal with ambivalence and competing values, while also strengthening these European values which Helena mentioned. But we have again this caveat can, because it can also contribute to reinforce one-dimensional oversimplification or simplification. And a lot of what interpretation did in the past and what was propagated in the past was to be simple. So simple and that people in leisure mode can follow with as little effort as possible. And it was advocated that it should aim for a simple theme, which can be expressed in one sentence. And this was also considered as the single central message in support of the mission of the conservation agency that owns the site or the building or whatever. So it's clear that this would contradict what is needed today when we look at the challenges of the 21st century. So what can we do? And what's the opportunity that interpretation can offer? It can open minds for reflection because the setting is away from the busy everyday life. We have heard that an openness is a prerequisite to become open for inspiration. And that's something where when people come to visit interpretive sites, they are usually away from this hectic of the everyday life. By looking at the past, we can also avoid direct confrontation. If we tell stories about the past which are not directly related to the visitors' identities, then they are more likely to be open for difficult questions. And if that happens, they we can facilitate interpretations and stories that can help them experience opposing and at the same time valid points of view if we engage in multiple perspectives interpretation. And they can experience that ambivalence is quite a normal thing for human beings, and they might learn to become wary of one-dimensional simplistic views. So when we want, now what can we do when we want to engage in multiple perspectives interpretation? One thing we can do is to explore how a story can be told if we deliberately change the point of view from different persons, individuals or groups who lived in that history we are talking about. If it's about cultural heritage like this marketplace in the city center of Freiburg. So there are the perspectives of those who were in power at that time. There were the average citizens. There might have been immigrants who had lived at that place and went abroad, and immigrants who arrived as new foreigners in the city. There might be minorities, like there have been, of course, minorities. And then the question is what this church or the town hall meant for, let's say, Jewish or marginalized groups. And there might have been nonconformists living at a certain time period, let's say in the late Middle Ages or whenever in history in the city. By changing these perspectives and trying to create a vivid image what it meant to live in such a position, we can induce empathy, or at least try to try to help people to become more empathic. So when we analyze historic values and value conflicts, then what we can do is, in order to find them and to find ambivalence, we can list historic people and groups for whom the site we are interpreting might have been meaningful in different ways. And we can explore which values might have resonated from their perspectives. We can highlight the stories and in a way that competing values, tensions, or conflicts become apparent. And we can also think this through by looking into what might have been relevant non-values also at that time. And from that, with such a preparation, we can identify potential interpretive plots which include ambivalence. This is an exercise which will lead you, and you will need, when you apply that, to speculate to a certain extent, but it is a heuristic approach which can direct your research of a theme in a way that you can find these angles that provide experience of ambivalence. When you analyze this, it's of interest to look where and to be aware of where value tensions and conflicts can occur, because this is, in some cases, within an individual, we all know that we are torn apart in a difficult situation where we have to decide for the one or the other, and we think both is positive, and any decision will have a trade-off, which we do not like, then this can also be applied to a socio-cultural group with in partly at least shared value system and meaning system. And for these two, it is a matter of internal conflicts within a system of values and within a system of meanings, which can in itself nevertheless be coherent despite these different tensions. But it can also occur, of course, between diverse groups, and then you have open conflict often, or resolutions due to the more powerful who exerts their power at the expense of those who have less power. That happened very often in history. So
sorry,
as
Patrick, we
interpreters, we may find ambivalence at all these levels. So what does that mean in practice? We can use this when we engage visitors with ambivalent interpretation. Here that's golden stepping stones, or not gold, bronze, that have been inserted in the pavement where Jewish citizens of Freiburg have been deported to the concentration camps. And with a group, with a guide and a group of visitors. But I also want to stress that this is even more, there are even more possibilities when we engage people through interpretive co-creation, which means that we have different parts of the community from different backgrounds, and they, together with us as interpreters, create a new interpretation from multiple perspectives, which will then be presented to others.
I'm sorry,
And
Patrick, for
yes,
interrupting, but we have to conclude. So please,
yes.
conclude
So that here we are, as professional interpreters, we are also a facilitator and a leader to a creative collaborative process. We have heard this already by Neil, for example. So we can facilitate empathy. We can co-create narratives which resonate with competing values. We can counter in such a dialogue and in such a process oversimplifications, cliché and stereotypes, and we can provide food for thinking, which might lead to an action at the site, stop and ponder, or after one has visited, that one reflects quietly on what one has experienced during the site visit. Maybe if there's one thing I would like you to remember of this presentation, this is a quote from Leslie Hazelton: "Everything is paradox. The danger is one-dimensional thinking." Thank you.
Thank you very much for this insightful presentation, Patrick. Big bravo for you. There are some questions, and I think I got the question, but you stole our time for this, so I will be quick. Albert 𝐕𝐵𝐺 is asking if and how the post-war history of Berlin, time of certain bipolarity, was influenced somehow your interests.
My interest was roused by when I was in charge of preparing a conference on sensitive heritage and sensitive interpretation in Krakow. And there, exactly this story about the cross and these cobblestones, this ambivalent story, is one story that is related, also linked to the fall of the Iron Curtain. So this was one thing, but the other more important aspect was that there I felt much more confronted with the heritage of the Nazi occupation than I ever was confronted with that in my hometown where I grew up in Nuremberg, where you did not see so many sites related to Nazism as I had encountered there. So, and this roused the question for me, what is our responsibility in our profession that something like that does not happen again? And then very quickly after I worked and researched the work of Hannah Arendt, how it is relevant, can be relevant for heritage interpretation and heritage interpretation theory, I came to this direction. So this is just a tiny thing about this research.
Thank you very much. I found your presentation very inspiring, so thank you very much for this. Especially, I think that we are now living in the, I would say, fear of simplistic views. So your presentation was very important when we see in what direction the European society is going. So that's why I note that we can say that heritage interpretation has a power, or maybe even the responsibility, as you said, to foster our ability to deal with ambivalence. So this is what I learned from your presentation. And I think that in European society, we are defined by questioning almost everything, but with a discussion and openness to different views. So I think that heritage interpretation has more to deal with it. At the end,
yes, maybe if I may add,
yes,
and
yes, of course.
The art of interpretation and an interpreter is trying and seeking to find the valid points in the different positions.
Yeah.
So
indeed.
in the different points of view, so that we do not include one section of the society, because very often, if they are genuine in their concerns, and that is even, I would even say that many who lean towards the right-wing populism, but this is driven by genuine concerns, and I think it's important to find where the valid points are, if there are any, and to make them heard again, and so that they do not feel excluded, but included in and represented in the overall picture.
Mm-hmm.
And the openness to ambivalence makes this easier.
Yes, indeed. True. It's very true. So this was the message from Freiburg. So thank you, Patrick, for that. Oh, by the way, I got the confirmation of your picture. Magdalena Banaszkiewicz noted that we are talking about the first slide. Yes, indeed, my local pavement. How nice to see it. So let me conclude with this special message from Krakow. which inspired you to conduct your research. Congratulations for your speech and for your presentation. And with this presentation, ladies and gentlemen, we are concluding the first day of the conference. I am inviting you for tomorrow only in Polish. So to the Polish listeners, let's meet tomorrow morning. Thank you very much. This is the end of this panel. Thank you very much for the presenting and for listening this interesting presentation. Thank you. Bye.